story goes. And, we have to talk about the Crusades if you want to talk about the misrepresentations of, how people understand things. So Islam from the year 636 to, I mentioned 1032, I mentioned 732, the Battle of Tours, but then all the way, there's so many more battles I discussed, and by 1070, Islam now has conquered Asia Minor. This is one of the oldest Christian regions. Most of St. Paul's letters are to Asia Minor, because that's how Christian it was. Now it's Turkey, we call it, okay? But at that point, this is right before the Crusades, they were almost near Constantinople, and the Eastern Emperor called for aid, and the Christians saw what was happening to the Armenians and the Greek Christians in Anatolia, and the sources are horrific. Tens and thousands of Christians being massacred, butchered, enslaved, churches burning in one city, one Armenian city, Ani, 1,000 churches were burned intentionally. It was, so, when you hear about ISIS, the Islamic State, it was that on steroids. But it was actually not a bunch of terrorists. It was the caliphate. It was a sultanate. It was the representatives of Islam who were talking this way and who were acting this way. And that's the origins of the First Crusade, which I find very interesting, because the First Crusaders learned what was happening to the Christians of the East, as well as to the church and the Holy Land, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was, of course, important to them. And that's why they went there. It was actually a heroic stance against aggression. And it completely accorded with what Christian teaching says is just war theory. Okay, we're liberating, we're defending. It's not aggression. This is originally Christian territory before it became Muslim. So we're going there to wage crusade. And it was, of course, for centuries seen as one of the most noble, altruistic Christian things. Today, of course, it's the most demonic thing. And Christians are still being pounded on the head about the crusade. Why? Because the whole story has been completely subverted. And I've read so many historians, and I can name them, and I know them. You might know them. You might not know these names, but they're very big in America. People like John Esposito, Karen Armstrong, who purport to be historians. They will present Islam spreading peacefully for the first few centuries, and everything was fine. And then in the year 1095, these evil Catholics decided to go and just create war and havoc. So it's presented in a vacuum, as usual. And this is something that happens today in politics when we talk about modern day instances and events. They're presented in a vacuum. You're not told that Muslims were massacring, killing, torturing, raping, burning churches. One caliph before the Crusades burned 30,000 churches in Syria and Egypt alone. Okay? So the problem with so many of the lies today is not that they are not telling you the truth. It's they're withholding the background. So they tell you the truth. Yeah, these crusaders went, fought, and killed. Sounds kind of bad. But they're not telling you what the Muslims were doing to provoke all this anger. Righteous anger, I would argue. So to me, this is another... That's why I've very much gravitated towards the historical aspect, not just because there's such an evident continuity between what Muslims have been doing to Christians, but because it really makes sense of why Islam is the way it is today, because it hasn't changed, okay? But when they put it in your head that Islam, if you go to any college or watch a documentary, Islam is peace, and the only time you have barbarians, it's in the Middle Ages when you get the Crusaders, and then they ruin it, and they alienate Muslims who are hitherto tolerant and open-minded. That's all lies. That's just completely fabricated, and it's meant to demonize, honestly, the Christians as opposed to the Muslims. And to stick one more point about the Crusades, everyone here has heard of the Crusades, right? Whether you like them or dislike them, you've heard of them. But the fact is, if you stand back from a macro historical point of view and you look at all the wars and conflicts and antagonism between Christians and Muslims, the Crusades are a drop in the bucket, very insignificant. You don't hear about the Muslim attacks that swallowed up vast portions, as I told you, of North Africa and the Middle East, or how they swallowed up Asia Minor, or how they conquered Constantinople. Spain was conquered, and it took them 800 years of warfare. Okay? People don't know that Muslims went as far as Iceland in the 16th century to get slaves. Okay? And Denmark, actually. And England. They had I think it's called Lundy, a little island off the coast of England, where they raided the English coast for slaves. And then you look in the east, same thing with the Ottomans. I remember reading in their documents and chronicles, every year they'd come back with 50, 100,000 Hungarians, or Slavs in general, which is where we get the word Slav or slaves. Then there's the Russians, and that's completely been sidestepped because Russians are not hip anymore. But they're part of this long story too. You probably heard of the Mongol yoke or the Tatar yoke, where the Russians were actually conquered by the Mongols. What you don't hear is they actually were converts to Islam, the Tatars as they're known, and they also brought in the whole panoply of Islamic law, discrimination, hostility, and the Russians were living under that for centuries. So if you actually look in these Russian chronicles, they're not fighting against Mongols, they're fighting against Muslims. Okay, so this was a really multi-tentacled jihad, if you will, on every corner of America. Even the United States of America, not America, of the world, even the United States of America, few people know this, its first war as a nation. So, of course, it had the Revolutionary War with Britain. After it gained independence, maybe 10 years later, it actually was drawn into another first war as a nation with Muslims, the so-called Barbary pirates of North Africa, because it was their job to enslave Christian vessels that they would find and take the Christians and plunder them, etc., etc. And none other than Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Congress. It's dated, I have it in one of my books, like 1796. And he talks about how he met the Muslim ambassador from Barbary and said, "Why are you doing this? We want to make peace. Don't attack our vessels." And then he quotes what the Barbary ambassador said. And the quote is like reading ISIS talking to us. The Quran says you're an infidel, you're our enemy. It's our duty based on the Quran, on our prophet, to attack you, plunder you, kill you, make subjects of you and slaves, and destroy your churches, etc., etc. So you can only imagine what Mr. Thomas Jefferson thought, because he's the paragon of the Enlightenment, after you heard that kind of logic. Okay, but so the point is to show you this has been going on for so long that I always find it mind-boggling to have someone come and tell me, "Oh no, Islam means peace, and the radical thing, that's something new. That just happened." No, it didn't. And so, to move back to the modern Christian era, to me, it's just a continuity. There's no difference, because the same stuff that happened then, they were destroying churches in Christian regions. As I told you, one caliph, 30,000 churches. That's according to Muslim sources. Okay, this isn't an exaggeration. That's what they say. And this was seen as a work of piety. So it's little wonder that the remnants of Christians, whether they're Copts in Egypt or Assyrians in Iraq, in Syria, or Armenians, if you know what's happening with Azerbaijan and Armenia, there's another genocide going on, which is entirely based, again, on religion, though no media will tell you that. It's just a territorial dispute. Okay? But if you dig deep down inside, you're going to find it's the same exact dynamic. The first thing these Azerbaijanis do is they go and destroy churches, break the crosses, and turn it into a mosque. Okay? They go to Christian cemeteries and destroy and pulverize the crosses because they don't want to see it. And they want to claim it's our land, and we're never Christians here in the first place. So it's sad on the one hand that this is a very long history which has been suppressed, and therefore we don't understand current events. So when you see Christians being persecuted, one of the reasons or one of the excuses a talking head today will say, "Oh, it's because of this. It's because of grievances, or it's a territorial dispute." No, dig deep down inside. It's always the old ancient religious hostility for Christians. Now,